The EUDR is a legislation, European legislation. That means it's like the highest level of regulation that you can have in the EU. And it is designed to stop import products related to deforestation.
European Union Deforestation Regulation, EUDR, ready or not? Hannelore, we keep using and talking about this word deforestation, which can of course be interpreted in many and various ways. How exactly is deforestation defined in the EUDR?
Well, I think if we look into the EUDR, compared to all efforts that have been done, not only by the EU, but also by other trade blocs or countries or associations or certifications, there's a very strict interpretation of what is deforestation. It is legal deforestation. So even in a country, any country that produces, for example, cocoa or coffee, and that allows some deforestation because it's regulated and it's legal, even that will not be accepted by the EU. This means not just that it's more difficult to accept for the countries, but also that we can't properly use the systems that they had already in place to monitor their deforestation, because they only monitor what would be illegal in their country. But now EU also considers what is legal. They use the terminology of turning forest into agricultural use. They have tried to explain what is an agricultural use, but there remain many vague or gray areas that are common practice in many countries and for many sectors on agricultural use. I'm just talking plantation of eucalyptus, for example, where later you replace it by coffee. It is not clear yet what will happen for that. So that, of course, doesn't help the nerves of everybody involved. So, but it's a very strict definition, but it's not completely clear.
It appears that the EUDR does place high emphasis on traceability. Would you agree with that? And of course, the question is, what exactly does traceability mean?
I think many would put this on the first place. The traceability of the product takes a very, very strong position in the EUDR. In fact, the EUDR asks that you can trace back the product to the plot of the farm. So you would not need to know for each piece of rubber, for each pack of coffee, which plots effectively have contributed to this. I think everybody realized that this is a very difficult one. For many of the value chains, for different reasons, where today this is not possible to trace something back to the plot. If it is already possible to trace it back to the farmer, it's certainly not possible to trace it back to the plot. As some companies then indicated that, in fact, this full traceability is also not necessary to guarantee that there is no deforestation. The EU has added in the frequently asked questions possibility of a declaration in excess, meaning that you check all the plots of a certain group of producers of a certain product. You give all the plots. You give the risk assessment that there would have been deforestation, and you don't trace back each product to one of these plots. You just say it comes from these plots that we have checked, and all of them have been checked, and all of them are deforestation free, but we don't exactly know from which plot comes what. So it avoids the first mile traceability while still guaranteeing that there's no deforestation. I think that's also an important one today in the implementation that has come across. The EU will not, it's not said in the EUDR, and also it's clearly from the frequently asked questions that we've had until now, the EU will not validate approaches to do the risk assessment of deforestation or traceability. They will not validate approaches. They will also not give guidelines. And they say it's too context specific and too product specific and too sector specific, obviously. This means it's up to the private sector to find a solution on how to do this. And as most of you will know by now, that this has led to a complete dispersed approach by the private sector to find their own ways, their own methods. And that is the situation today. There is very little buy-in for joint initiatives which have been stimulated and which obviously agencies or countries or EU itself looks into, can we do something jointly to have it efficiently implemented? But the buy-in today is very, very little. So it has started like, you find your own way, do it. We won't approve any method.
Hannelore, let's look deeper at the EUDR. Are there additional specific implications that will have an impact, not just today, but also looking into the future?
It's been launched as a due diligence legislation. Due diligence normally says you write a report as a company on how you source your product, what the situation is where you source it, what are risks for any type of externality in this area, and how do I contribute to improve it, and then how do I integrate it in my own policies as a company. EUDR is, in fact, not a traditional and classical due diligence regulation, although it's promoted like that. Why not? Because, in fact, it is yes or no. If you don't comply, if the risk is too high that your product has been related to deforestation or you can't prove it, then you can't put it on the market. So it's not so much as I do a self-assessment and I demonstrate that I engage to improve the certain aspects. It's yes or no. So in the end, the impact is a trade restriction. Yeah, and I think that plays very strong in the private sector, but also between countries. Like, it might be implemented as a trade restriction, and I'm sure that hasn't helped a dialogue which was already quite one-sided in the past. Second, I think it's important to know that this also covers the products and the crops related to these products produced in EU, because if you've produced them in EU, you put them on the market in the EU, or you export them from the EU. So these products are covered. That was included because otherwise the WTO would never accept such a legislation that could restrict trade. So it also has to be applied to the EU's own production. As a matter of fact, the agricultural sector, which is mostly involved and impacted in the EU, is only waking up now. And they start to realize how difficult, even for more developed agricultural countries, this is to implement, and how heavy the administrative burden can be on smallholders, on farmers. Yeah, so I think it's also good to keep that in mind when we will talk about, how will this now be implemented and what is happening in the background in the EU.
So the additional implications of the EUDR are, as I see it, quite significant. And one of the biggest ones, of course, is that the EUDR could be seen as a trade restriction. The list of products from the EUDR can be amended at any time. The EUDR does use a very strict definition of deforestation, and it does benchmark countries for the risk of deforestation. EUDR asks very strict traceability of the product. And of course, there is a question of scalability of the EUDR as well. The EU leaves it completely open to the private sector to find ways, methods, concepts to comply, giving way to a dispersed approach of traders and operators to comply, and there is very little legal basis to disprove a certain approach. And the check of operators and their shipments will be implemented by authorities of the EU member states. European Union Deforestation Regulation, EUDR, ready or not?